I heard my father before I saw him. It was the same voice that used to call me in for dinner when I was a girl, firm, certain, the kind of voice that expected the world to line up neatly behind it, only now, it carried through a packed hall of uniforms and families. Floating above the low murmurs like a claim, "She dropped out of the Navy," he said to a nearby group of officers, not whispered, but stated like a fact he had stamped and filed away years ago. "Couldn't handle the heat, but my boy. Tyler, now he is a different story." Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, while someone else got all the credit? Let me know your story down in the comments. I would love to know who is part of our community and what time you are listening to this. Anger burns too hot and too quickly. It is wasteful. I did not feel anger. I felt clarity. For a moment, my body reacted the way it always had, a tightening in the chest, a small, familiar ache behind the ribs. But this was not a breakdown, this was accounting. I stood at the back of the hall with my hands folded and my shoulders relaxed. I was wearing civilian clothes, no uniform, no insignia, no medals. To the crowd, I was just a woman in her late middle age, maybe a teacher or a nurse. That was the point. I had spent my adult life learning how to be invisible when visibility served no purpose. My name is Madison, and for 34 years, I have lived a life my family could never even imagine. I watched my father, Christopher, basking in the spotlight of Tyler's achievement. He loved tradition, but only when it fit his narrow expectations. He liked stories he could tell over coffee after church. My silence had become an inconvenience to him, so he filled the blanks with a simpler narrative. That I was a cowardly failure who had wasted $80,000 of his money. The truth was that I had paid for my own education through 3 jobs, and sheer discipline. He had simply taken the credit while throwing money at Tyler like it was confetti. I did not cry. I did not ask why he was lying again. I simply reached into my navy blazer and pulled out my phone. My father had recently purchased a $75,000 luxury truck for Tyler to celebrate his real service. Christopher had used me as the secret guarantor for that loan, assuming my high credit score and silent reliability were his to exploit forever. He viewed my compassion as a luxury he could overdraft whenever he pleased. I opened my banking app. It was exactly 11:57, with a few clinical taps. I withdrew my guarantee. A notification flashed on the screen. Guarantee successfully removed. Primary borrower must provide new collateral within 24 hours. Christopher did not have 24 cents of liquid assets. He lived entirely on the illusion of my stability. Next, I accessed the joint family account. It was a fund I had been depositing money into for years, a safety net for emergencies that he used to fund Tyler's lifestyle. There was $42,000 in there. Money I had earned in the windowless rooms of military intelligence. While my family assumed I was failing, I hit transfer. The balance dropped to 0. By 12:03, the retaliation was complete. I put the phone back in my pocket and looked at the stage. My father was still laughing, his voice firm and certain, unaware that the floor beneath his feet had just been deleted. He had spent years reminding me that I didn't belong, that I was less than. He wasn't shocked by what he had done to me. He was about to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a balance sheet adjustment. The word "a dropout" has a specific weight. To my father, Christopher, it was a label for a failed investment. He used it to explain away a daughter who didn't fit into the loud, heroic narrative he had pre-written for his children. For years, I allowed him to carry that lie like a trophy. It was a subscription to his own ego, and I had been the silent investor footing the bill. The reality was far colder. I hadn't dropped out. I had been recruited. While Tyler was training in the visible mud and grit, I was being moved into rooms where air conditioning hummed and the lights never went out. I studied logistics and strategic intelligence because I learned early that a bullet is just a piece of lead without a supply chain to deliver it. I became a ghost in the machine of national security. My career was built on the kind of silence that keeps people alive, but to my family, that silence looked like emptiness. I lived inside a set of invisible chains, the kind of discipline that requires you to let your own father call you a failure so that a mission can succeed. It was a house with no bars, a prison of duty where my only escape was my own integrity. I watched from the shadows as Christopher used the $80,000 I had supposedly wasted to bolster his status at the country club. In truth, I had been the one making the secret $96,000 payments on his mortgage for the last 4 years through a blind trust. Every meal he ate, every boast he made about Tyler's real service, was subsidized by the daughter he claimed was a burden. My compassion was a resource he had overdrafted until the account was dry. I had been the architect of his comfort while he was the foreman of my humiliation. I remembered being 12 years old when he told me I was a phase, not a future. He was wrong. I was the foundation he didn't realize he was standing on. As I sat in the back row of that hall, I didn't feel the need to defend my path. My life didn't need witnesses to be valid. I looked at my hands, still folded, they were steady, my posture was a standard, not a personality trait. I wasn't there to seek the approval that had been denied to me for 3 decades, I was there as a spectator to a story that was about to be rewritten by a higher authority. The air in the room grew heavy as the ceremony transitioned from the preliminaries to the main event. My father leaned over and whispered to my mother, Melissa, likely another jab about my mediocrity. I didn't look at them, I watched the flags, they were perfectly still. The silence in the room was now a different kind of armor, quiet, disciplined, and lethal. The truth was arriving, and it didn't ask for my father's permission to speak. The air in the reception hall was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the suffocating weight of my father's ego. Christopher had organized a pre-ceremony mixer, a stage where he could parade Tyler like a prize stallion while keeping me in the shadows where he thought I belonged. He moved through the crowd of officers and families, his voice boisterous, his hand constantly on Tyler's shoulder. I stood by the buffet table, a ghost in a room full of people who only knew the version of me he had carefully curated: the failure, the dropout, the disappointment. Christopher spotted me and signaled with a sharp, commanding flick of his wrist. He didn't see a daughter, he saw a prop to highlight Tyler's brilliance. Madison, he called out, his voice cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. Since you're just standing there, why don't you make yourself useful? He gestured to the bottle of expensive scotch he'd bought for the occasion. Fill up your brother's glass, and his teammates, it's the only form of service a dropout can offer a real warrior. The room went quiet. I could feel the eyes of 27 people on me, officers, neighbors, people I had known since childhood. Tyler looked away, his jaw tight with a discomfort he didn't have the courage to voice. I walked over and picked up the bottle, my hands were perfectly steady. I didn't feel the sting of the insult because I had already closed that account. My compassion had been a luxury Christopher had overdrafted for decades, and the bank was finally closed. As I poured the amber liquid, the golden child and his friends watched in an awkward silence. There, Christopher said, clapping Tyler on the back while looking directly at me with a smirk that felt like a challenge. Learn to serve those who actually made it through training. He pulled out his phone, and I knew exactly what was coming next. He was a man who performed his life for an audience. A notification pinged in my pocket moments later. He had posted a photo of the ceremony program on Facebook, the caption reading, "One child leading the way, the other a reminder that not everyone is built for the name Madison carries." I didn't react, I didn't type a rebuttal or delete my account, I simply adjusted the cuff of my blazer and looked at my father. He wasn't shocked by his own cruelty, he was energized by it. He thought he was in a position of absolute power, holding my supposed failures over my head like a debt I could never repay. But he had forgotten that I was the one who had managed the logistics of his existence for years. I was the silent architect of the very floor he was currently dancing on. Inside, my mind was already shifting from the emotional transaction to a much colder calculation. I thought about the security file I had received that morning, the one I hadn't yet opened in its entirety. There were shadows in our family's financial books that didn't match the light Christopher tried to shine on himself. If this was to be a war of reputation, he had brought a knife to an artillery duel. He continued his performance, laughing and bragging, while I stood silently, counting down the minutes until the mask he wore was torn away by the very truth he tried to bury. I stepped away from the suffocating air of the reception and into the clinical silence of a side corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, electric frequency that matched the stillness in my chest. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. It was about a lethal discovery that redefined every year I had spent serving in the shadows. My father, Christopher, had built his entire identity on the narrative of my failure, but as I opened the encrypted file on my secure device, I realized his own story was built on a foundation of theft. The shadows in the books were darker than I had imagined. My mother had left a trust fund, $750,000, intended solely for me. Christopher had looked me in the eye 10 years ago and told me she died with nothing but medical debt. He had used my grief as a smokescreen to hide his own greed. As I scrolled through the digitized records, I found the authorized withdrawals. Every single one was signed with my name, a forgery so blatant it felt like a physical assault. This was the criminal twist that removed any remaining path to redemption for him. He wasn't just a toxic parent, he was a criminal who had exploited the daughter he publicly called a burden. The math was cold and undeniable. While I had been secretly making the $96,000 payments on his mortgage for the last 4 years to keep a roof over his head, he had been draining my inheritance to fund his bad investments and Tyler's lavish lifestyle. I had been the silent investor in his performance of a perfect life, while he was the thief of my future. I didn't feel the urge to cry or scream. Anger is a luxury I cannot afford in my line of work. Instead, I felt the clinical clarity of a mission briefing. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a systematic prosecution. I contacted Marcus, a senior attorney at the military prosecutor's office. I had coordinated logistics for his teams in high-stakes fraud cases before. He was one of the few who knew my real rank and the weight of the secrets I carried. The evidence is irrefutable, I told him, my voice reflecting the discipline of 34 years of service. I want a formal notice drafted immediately. Prepare a criminal complaint for identity theft and misappropriation of funds. Marcus confirmed he would have the papers finalized within 60 minutes. The professional escalation was now a relentless force of nature. Christopher thought he was watching Tyler's moment of glory, but he was actually watching the seconds tick away on his own legacy. I closed the file, and the screen's blue light faded, leaving me in the dim hallway. The transition was now complete. I had spent a lifetime holding on to the invisible chains of duty and silence, letting my family treat me as an afterthought. But those chains had transformed into a noose for the man who tried to use them to control me. He had overdrafted my compassion until the account was empty, and now the reckoning was a debt he would have to pay in full. The truth didn't need to be loud to be devastating, it just needed to be documented. I adjusted my blazer and turned back toward the main hall. The final judgment was waiting, and I was no longer the invisible daughter, I was the architect of his downfall. The Grand Hall of the Joint Special Operations Command was a place where the air itself felt heavy with the weight of things unsaid. It smelled of floor wax, starch, and the kind of discipline that does not require an audience to exist. I took my seat in the very back row, slightly off-center. Leaning into the shadows, I was a ghost in a room full of monuments. My father, Christopher, sat in the front row with my mother, Melissa. I could see the back of his head, squared, rigid, and vibrating. With a pride that was entirely self-serving, he felt powerful in this room because he believed he was the architect of Tyler's success. Christopher lived in the illusion of power. To him, authority was something you shouted until everyone else went quiet. He believed that because he had a loud voice and a daughter he could label a failure, he was a leader. But there is a profound difference between having the symbols of status and being a person of character. For years, my father's position in our family and our town was a costume he had rented using my silent contributions and my willingness to play the role of the disappointment. He was a man made of borrowed prestige, and because he had no internal value to stand on, he was about to discover how quickly a hollow shell can collapse. The ceremony began with the clinical precision of a military operation. A command rang out, the flags were posted, and the band played with a measured cadence. My brother, Tyler, stood among the candidates at the front. He looked sharp, focused, and completely unaware that the ground beneath our family was about to shift. Christopher leaned toward my mother and whispered something, a smirk playing on his lips. I didn't need to hear him to know he was making one last comparison between his warrior son and his dropout daughter. Then, the general entered. He moved with the unhurried steadiness of a man who carried the invisible authority of 10,000 life and death decisions in his bones. He didn't scan the room out of curiosity, he read it like a map. His gaze moved across the front rows, the dignitaries, and the families, until it reached the back. It reached me. Our eyes met, and there was no searching, no confusion, there was only recognition, the kind that lands quietly, like a hand on a shoulder. In a tone so calm it almost blended into the silence, he said the words that would delete my father's reality, "Rear Admiral, you're here?" For a heartbeat, the hall didn't move, the air itself felt frozen, and then, as if responding to a single, unspoken command, 200 SEALs, including my brother, rose to their feet in one clean, unified motion. The sound wasn't a roar. It was a wave of respect that hit the room and left a stunned quiet in its wake. Chairs scraped softly, boots aligned, and 200 of the most dangerous men on the planet stood at attention for me. I didn't smile, I didn't flinch, I simply stood up slowly, because returning respect matters, and I would not turn this moment into a performance. Behind me, I felt the air leave my father's lungs. When I turned my head slightly, I saw Christopher frozen in place. His face was drained of color, his mouth slightly open as if the words he had used to bury me for 30 years had suddenly turned to ash in his throat. This was the death of his illusion. He was seeing the difference between the story he had told and the truth that had found him without my help. He had spent decades treating me like an afterthought, assuming my quiet life was a failure, but my life was a duty he wasn't qualified to understand. He had no internal resources to deal with this realization because his entire ego was tied to being better than a daughter who was actually his superior in every measurable way. He sat there, pale and diminished, realizing too late that the person he had mocked was the only reason he still had a name worth carrying. The ceremony ended with a silence that felt heavier than the band's music. Families swarmed the floor, a sea of white and blue, but a small perimeter of empty space remained around me, a buffer zone of respect. My father, Christopher, finally managed to move. He approached me with the jerky, uncertain steps of someone who had just seen the ground disappear from under his feet. His face, once so full of boisterous certainty, was now a map of absolute ruin. "Madison," he whispered, his eyes darting frantically to the officers nearby, checking to see who was listening. "Sweetheart, we need to keep this in the family. We can't have people thinking I'm a liar. Just think of the reputation. Think of your mother. This was all just a big misunderstanding." I looked at him, and for the first time in 34 years, I felt nothing but a quiet, clinical detachment. He wasn't sorry for the decades of neglect or the lies he had told to make me small. He was terrified of the exposure. He wanted to have the status of a proud father without ever being one. His entire position was a costume he had rented with my silence, and the lease had just expired. "It is too late for the family stories, Christopher," I said. My voice was the sound of a closing vault. I reached into my navy blazer and handed him a single, heavy manila envelope. Inside, "You will find the documentation of the $750,000 you stole from the trust my mother left for me. Every forged signature is highlighted, every unauthorized withdrawal is tracked. I have already turned these over to the military prosecutor." He began to stammer, his hands trembling so violently the papers rattled. You can't. I am your father." "You were the silent thief of my future," I replied, my eyes locked on his, "while I was secretly making the $96,000 payments on your mortgage to keep you from bankruptcy for the last 4 years. You were using my money to fund a life you didn't earn. I am divesting from this transaction. I have reclaimed the deed to the house. It is legally mine." I paused, letting the cold reality settle into his bones. "You and Melissa will have 30 days to relocate. I have already secured a small apartment for you in a modest facility. It is clean, it is adequate. It is exactly the level of care you provided for me when I was struggling. You will not contact me again." He looked like a man who had been stripped bare in public. The Rear Admiral wasn't a daughter he could bully. She was a superior officer issuing a final order. This wasn't the justice of punishment, which only looks at the past. This was the justice of the sower. I was clearing the toxic soil so something real could finally grow. My brother, Tyler, approached us. He stood in his pristine uniform, but his eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and a new, sharp respect. He had been the hero of our father's legends, but now he was seeing the architect of his reality. "Is it true?" he asked softly. "Everything," I said. I looked at my brother, not with bitterness, but with the perspective of a leader. "You have talent, Tyler, but you have been fed a diet of pride that will get you killed in the field. From now on, your assignments go through my office. You will learn the discipline of the unseen. You will learn that a warrior's true worth is measured by her silence, not her stories." He stood at attention, a reflexive, disciplined response that had nothing to do with our father's approval. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." I walked out of the ceremony hall and into the cool, night air. The salt air felt cleansing. Reconciliation is not about rewriting the past. It is about agreeing to tell the truth moving forward. I opened my phone one last time and deleted the family group chat. No more performance, just the quiet, steady river of a life lived on my own terms. The truth always stands firm without needing to shout. If you feel Madison did the right thing by choosing to build a real future instead of just punishing the past, please like and share this video to spread the message of resilience. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more journeys of reclaiming justice. Thank you for listening.